A bank door does not look dangerous. It looks like wood, glass, and a brass handle someone polishes every morning. But in the early 1930s, across small towns and city blocks all over America, that door became one of the most feared objects a family would ever face. People stood outside it in coats too thin for the weather, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Behind that door was every dollar a family had saved for 10, 20, 30 years. And one morning, without warning, the door simply did not open again. That is where this list begins. Not with a recipe, not with a jar, not with a grandmother's kitchen wisdom passed down like a comfortable old photograph. It begins with the one fact modern life rarely asks anyone to sit with. What happens when a crisis does not last a bad week, or a rough month, or even a hard year? What happens when it lasts the better part of a decade? Most families today have never been tested that way. A single paycheck stops, and the whole structure of a modern household starts to shake within 30, maybe 60 days. Credit cards fill in the gap for a while. Then they stop filling it. Delivery apps, subscriptions, financing plans, all of it depends on one quiet assumption, that the emergency will end soon. The families of the Great Depression did not get that assumption. For them, the emergency was the new normal, and it did not end soon. It lasted for years. And somehow, millions of American households kept functioning inside it, not comfortably, not without hunger, not without real fear, but functioning. They found income where there was no job. They found food where there was no store credit. They found shelter by folding two families into one house. They survived on skill, cooperation, and a kind of stubborn practical intelligence that never once depended on things going back to normal. This is not a nostalgic list. Nobody here is going to tell you the 1930s were simple, wholesome, or somehow better than today. They were not. There was real hunger in real kitchens. There was real shame in men who could not find work for years, not weeks. There was real fear in mothers who did not know if there would be food on the table in March, let alone by winter. Nothing about that decade deserves to be romanticized, and nothing in this video is going to pretend otherwise. But inside that hardship was a different kind of intelligence, one built entirely around the idea that survival could not depend on one job, one bank, or one plan. It had to depend on many small working systems, all running at the same time, all built to last for years instead of days. That is the real subject of this video, 12 of the actual mechanisms American families used to survive a crisis that refused to end. Income that reinvented itself when a job disappeared. Food that regenerated instead of simply running out. Objects that were repaired instead of replaced, for years, not once. And communities that quietly functioned as insurance long before anyone used that word for people helping their neighbors. If you are watching this because you remember a parent or a grandparent who lived through those years, you already know something about this without being told directly. You remember a house that did not panic when things got hard. You remember an adult who seemed to already know what to do, long before the situation became an emergency for anyone else. And if you are watching this with a quieter, more uncomfortable question in the back of your mind, a question about your own home, your own savings, your own ability to keep a family fed and sheltered if a real crisis lasted not weeks, but years, that question is exactly what this video is built to sit with. They were poor. Many of them were frightened. But as you are about to see, 12 times over, they were not helpless. The real question this video is asking is quieter than that, and harder to answer comfortably. Would you be? The first thing families learned, often within weeks of losing steady work, was that one paycheck had never been a plan. It had only ever been a habit. And habits, unlike systems, do not survive when the world underneath them changes. Lesson 1. Income did not come from a job. It came from a skill. In many American towns during those years, a man who lost his factory job did not spend the next decade waiting for that same job to come back. He looked at what he knew how to do with his hands and he turned it into something someone else needed. A father who understood engines fixed his neighbor's truck for a few coins, or for a sack of flour, or for nothing more than the promise that the favor would be returned someday. A mother who could sew fast and well did not simply mend her own family's clothes, she mended other people's coats, patched other people's shoes, altered other people's hand-me-downs, and in exchange, something came back into the house. A haircut for 2 dozen eggs, a repaired chair for a bag of potatoes. Nobody wrote these exchanges down in a ledger because nobody needed to. The whole neighborhood was the ledger. This is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable, because here is the real question underneath it. If your income stopped tomorrow, not for a month, but for years, what skill do you actually have that another human being would trade for? Not a job title, not a resume line, an actual, transferable skill, done with your own 2 hands, that someone else in your neighborhood would value enough to give you food, or shelter, or help in return. Most modern households do not have an answer to that question, because modern life was never built to ask it. We built entire careers around specialization, one narrow task, done for one employer, paid in one currency, spent through one banking system. It is efficient, right up until the moment it isn't. During the Depression years, income was not something you were given. It was something you manufactured out of whatever you already knew. But even income that reinvented itself needed somewhere safe to land. And that is where the next lesson gets harder. Lesson 2. The bank was not where safety lived. Trust was. For families who had spent years putting a little aside, a coin here, a dollar there, slow and careful, the way people are taught to be responsible, the closing of a bank door was not just a financial event. It was a betrayal of the entire idea of responsibility itself. You did the right thing. You saved. You waited. And one morning, the doors simply did not open, and everything behind them, every year of discipline, was gone, or frozen, or simply unreachable. Families who survived that shock, and the years of instability that followed, learned something that modern households rarely have to learn anymore: that no single institution, no matter how solid it looks, should ever hold the entire weight of a family's survival. Some families began keeping small amounts of cash at home, not because they distrusted every bank forever, but because they had learned, the hard way, that a single point of failure is a dangerous place to put your whole future. Others built trust networks instead. A neighbor who would lend flour this month, knowing it would come back as sugar next month. A local store owner who extended credit to families he had known for 15 years because he understood that trust, unlike a bank balance, could not be frozen by a headline. Here is the part nobody likes to admit about modern life. We have recreated that same single point of failure, just with more comfortable branding. One direct deposit, one credit score, one app that manages the money, the budget, and the emergency fund, all in the same fragile system. If that one system stumbles, not for a day, but for a season, how many households actually have a second one standing behind it? The old home did not panic when one system failed, because it never depended on only one system in the first place. And once income and safety were spread across more than one basket, the next problem was even more immediate, because a family cannot eat trust, and a family cannot eat a coin saved under a floorboard. The next problem was dinner. Not tonight's dinner, next month's, next winter's, next year's. Lesson 3. The roof over your head was not always the one you were born under. This is where the story moves out of the kitchen and into the front hallway, because one of the quietest, least talked about survival strategies of the Depression years was simply this: families combined households. A grown son who lost his job moved his wife and children back in with his parents, not out of failure, but out of arithmetic. One roof, one set of utility bills, one garden, split between 8 or 10 people instead of maintained separately by 2 struggling households, was not a step backward. It was often the only math that worked. Grandparents who might otherwise have lived quietly and separately suddenly found themselves the center of a full house again, cooking for more people, stretching every ingredient further, but also gaining more hands to help carry the weight. Aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, under one roof, sharing labor, sharing food, sharing fear, and in doing so, cutting the cost of simply existing almost in half. There was no shame meant in this, even though shame often crept in anyway, because pride does not disappear just because the math demands cooperation. Families who had been taught that independence was the measure of success suddenly had to relearn an older, more practical lesson, that shared shelter was not weakness, it was strategy. Compare that to a modern household today, where the idea of 3 generations sharing one roof is often treated first as an inconvenience, and only second, if at all, as a financial strength. Many modern families would rather take on debt to preserve separate housing than combine resources to eliminate it. The old home understood something that the modern home has mostly forgotten. Shelter shared is shelter that lasts longer, for everyone under it. But shelter alone does not solve hunger, and this is where the story moves out into the yard, because the next lesson was not about saving food. It was about producing it, continuously, for years, without ever assuming the next harvest was guaranteed. Lesson 4. The garden was not a hobby, it was a second income. A backyard garden during those years was rarely something a family kept for pleasure or decoration. It was closer to a second job that never sent a paycheck, but never stopped paying either. Families planted not for one harvest, but for a rolling calendar. Early greens, followed by summer vegetables, followed by root crops that could sit in cool storage through the coldest months, followed by whatever came first again in spring. The garden was not a single event. It was a system designed to keep producing, season after season, year after year, regardless of what was happening at the bank or the factory gate. Chickens, when a family could keep them, extended that same logic. Eggs were not a treat. They were a form of currency that arrived daily, that could be eaten, sold, or traded, and that asked for very little in return beyond scraps and attention. A family with a working garden and a few hens had built something modern economics rarely talks about directly: a small, private, weatherproof income stream that did not depend on an employer, a market, or a government check. This is where the modern kitchen started to forget itself, quietly, over decades. Somewhere between the 1950s and today, the backyard stopped being a production system and became, for most families, simply a lawn, beautiful, maintained, and entirely unproductive. The average modern household spends money to maintain grass that produces nothing, while the Depression-era yard was working every single day to produce something that mattered. None of this means every family had land, or time, or the health to garden through hard years. Many did not, and many still went hungry despite every effort. This is not a claim that gardens solved the Depression. It is a claim that the households which built continuous, small-scale food production for themselves were noticeably more resilient than the households that depended entirely on wages and store shelves. A lesson that has not become less true simply because it has become less common. But even with a working garden, a shared roof, and a diversified skill set, some families still faced a harder truth. Sometimes, the work simply was not there, no matter how resourceful you were. And when that happened, some families did something that modern life treats as almost unthinkable. They left. Lesson 5. Some families did not wait for work, they followed it. Across the country, particularly in agricultural regions, entire families packed what they could fit into a car or a truck bed and followed the harvest calendar the way some animals follow the seasons. Cotton in one region, fruit in another, wheat somewhere else. The work moved, and so families moved with it, camping along roadsides, in temporary labor camps, in whatever shelter could be found near the next job. This was not adventure. It was often exhausting, humiliating, and dangerous, especially for children pulled in and out of schools, and for families treated as outsiders wherever they landed. There is no version of this lesson that should be told as inspiring without also being told as hard. Many of these families suffered in ways that no amount of resourcefulness could fully soften. And yet, inside that hardship, there is still a lesson modern life has almost entirely lost: the willingness to treat location itself as flexible, when staying still meant starving, and moving meant surviving. Modern households, by contrast, are often anchored by mortgages, school districts, and social routines to a single location, regardless of whether that location still offers any opportunity at all. The old families did not treat their address as sacred; they treated their survival as sacred and the address as negotiable. That is a harder pill to swallow today than a story about canning jars, because it asks a real question: how much of your own stability is actually about opportunity, and how much of it is simply about staying comfortable in one place, even when that place is quietly working against you? But no family, no matter how mobile or resourceful, could survive those years entirely alone. And this is where the final lesson of this half of the list becomes the most important one so far, because it was not about any single household. It was about the space between households. Lesson 6. The neighborhood was the insurance policy nobody paid a premium for. In towns and neighborhoods across the country, survival often depended less on what one family knew, and more on what an entire street collectively knew, together. One household understood engines. Another knew how to deliver a baby when no doctor was near or affordable. Another had a father who could re-roof a house in a weekend. Another had a mother who could turn almost nothing into a meal for 12. None of these families were self-sufficient on their own. But together, they formed something closer to a functioning insurance system, one built not on monthly payments, but on the quiet expectation that help given would eventually be help received. A woman who lost her husband did not necessarily face that loss with no support, because the women around her had already built an informal system of shared childcare, shared food, shared labor. A family whose crop failed one year could often survive because another family's crop had not, and the surplus moved sideways, between neighbors, long before it ever moved through any formal aid system. This is where the real cost of modern convenience becomes visible. Many people today do not know their neighbors well enough to ask for help, and many would feel a specific, modern kind of shame in asking at all. The old neighborhood was not sentimental about this, it was practical. Everyone understood that today's help was tomorrow's insurance, and nobody kept exact score, because keeping score was itself a kind of luxury nobody could afford. 6 lessons in, a pattern is already becoming clear, and it has nothing to do with grandmother's kitchen wisdom or a jar on a shelf. It has to do with redundancy, income that did not depend on one job, safety that did not depend on one bank, shelter that did not depend on one household standing alone, food that did not depend on one harvest, opportunity that did not depend on one location, and survival that did not depend on one family facing everything by itself. The modern home did not lose all of that redundancy at once. It lost it one convenience at a time, one generation at a time, until most households today are standing on a single point of failure in 6 or 7 different directions without ever realizing it. And there are still 6 more lessons to go. If the first 6 lessons were about how a family kept money, food, shelter, and support flowing when the world outside collapsed, the next 6 are about something quieter and, in some ways, harder to imitate: the internal discipline that made all of it possible. Because none of the first 6 lessons work without a household that has already decided, as a matter of identity, that nothing gets thrown away until it has been used completely. Lesson 7. Nothing was ever finished being useful. This did not simply mean saving jars or string, though those things happened too. It meant a fundamentally different relationship with objects. A coat was not retired when it wore out. It was taken apart, and the good fabric became something else. A patch, a child's smaller coat, a quilt square. A pair of shoes was not thrown away when the sole wore through. It was resold, sometimes more than once, by a father who had taught himself the basics, or by a cobbler paid in trade rather than cash. A broken chair leg was not a reason to buy a new chair. It was an afternoon's repair with 2 screws and a little wood glue, and the chair went back into service for another decade. This was not about sentimentality, and it was not about being unable to afford new things in some abstract sense. It was sharper than that. Every object a family already owned represented labor and money that had already been spent, and throwing it away meant spending that labor and money twice. A family that repaired instead of replaced was not just being careful, it was refusing to pay the same bill 2 times. Compare that to a modern household today, where a broken lamp, a torn jacket, or a wobbling chair is far more often simply discarded than repaired. Not necessarily because people are careless, but because almost nobody was taught how to fix these things anymore, and because buying new is marketed as easier, faster, and even more responsible than repairing old. Somewhere in the last several decades, an entire category of household skill, mending, patching, gluing, resoling, rewiring, quietly disappeared from ordinary family life and became something you call a specialist for, if you bother at all. The old home did not survive because it had more. It survived because it refused to let anything stop being useful until it had truly given everything it had. Lesson 8. Every wage earner in the house was a wage earner, regardless of age. Modern life tends to imagine the Depression-era household as one where the father worked and everyone else waited for him to come home. The truth is more complicated and in many ways more impressive. Women who had never worked for wages before found themselves taking in laundry, sewing piecework, selling baked goods door to door, or cleaning other people's homes, often while also running their own household completely. Children old enough to walk to a corner were often old enough to sell something there: newspapers, shined shoes, small errands run for a few coins. Even young children contributed in ways that seem startling by modern standards: gathering scrap metal, picking crops alongside parents, watching younger siblings so a mother could take in outside work. None of this is being presented here as something to romanticize. Child labor in this era was often genuinely harsh, and it came at a real cost to education and childhood itself, a cost that should not be minimized or waved away with a nostalgic soundtrack. But the underlying principle, stripped of its harshest edges, still holds a lesson modern households have mostly abandoned. Income did not belong to one person in the house. It belonged to the household as a whole, and everyone capable of contributing contributed in whatever way their age and ability allowed. Modern families, by contrast, are often built around a single primary earner or 2 earners whose combined income is entirely consumed by a fixed, inflexible cost of living, with no real expectation that anyone else in the household, including teenagers capable of some form of contribution, will add anything to the family's resilience. The old home did not treat income as one person's job. It treated survival as the whole household's job. Lesson 9. Heat, light, and comfort were rationed on purpose, long before anyone ran out completely. This is one of the harder lessons to absorb, because it asks a modern audience to imagine something most people today have never actually experienced: choosing to be cold, choosing to sit in a dim room, not because the electricity had been shut off, but because every degree of heat and every hour of light cost money that had somewhere else to go. Families rationed coal and firewood carefully across an entire winter, heating only the rooms that were actually being used, and gathering in one central room in the evening rather than warming the whole house. Lamps were lit only where someone was actually working or reading, and turned off the moment the task was finished. This was not deprivation for its own sake. It was a form of discipline that treated comfort itself as a resource to be budgeted, the same way money or food was budgeted. This next part sounds small until you realize how differently modern households treat the exact same resources. Today, heating and cooling an entire house to a constant, comfortable temperature, whether anyone is using most of those rooms or not, is treated as a baseline expectation rather than a choice. Lights are left on in empty rooms without a second thought. The old home did not have the luxury of that assumption, and in a strange way, that lack of luxury built a kind of muscle that modern homes have simply never had to develop: the ability to be uncomfortable, briefly and on purpose, in service of a longer-term plan. Lesson 10. Shame was managed with organization, not hidden with pretending. There is a part of this era that gets talked about far less often than the practical survival tactics, and it deserves real attention here, because it may be the most emotionally honest lesson on this entire list. Poverty during the Depression years often carried real, painful shame. Men who had built their identity around providing for a family now unable to find any work at all, for months, then years, and mothers doing extraordinary daily arithmetic just to put a plain meal on the table, while trying to shield children from understanding exactly how close to nothing the family actually had. Families did not typically manage that shame by pretending everything was fine, and they did not manage it by falling apart in front of each other either. Many managed it through quiet, almost invisible organization. A mother kept a small notebook where every coin had a destination before it was ever spent, not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, but because knowing exactly where things stood was less frightening than not knowing. A father who could not find steady work still left the house every morning, looking for it, because the discipline of trying mattered to his own sense of himself, even on days when he came home with nothing. This is not a comfortable lesson, and it should not be turned into one. It matters here because it points to something modern conversations about money rarely acknowledge directly: that the anxiety of financial instability is not only a practical problem, it is an emotional one, and the old home did not solve it by talking it away. It solved it, as much as it could be solved, through visible discipline and through the simple act of never letting the household feel like it had stopped trying. Lesson 11. Children were taught to wait, and taught early. One of the quieter forms of preparation that came out of those years was not a skill or a system at all. It was patience, deliberately instilled in children almost from the moment they were old enough to ask for something. A child who wanted a treat, a toy, or a new pair of shoes before the old ones were truly worn, through learned, often gently but very consistently, that the answer was not always no forever. It was often not yet. This mattered enormously, because a household under long-term financial pressure cannot function if every member of it expects immediate satisfaction of every want. Children who grew up during and just after those years often carried that lesson quietly into adulthood, long after the crisis had ended, which is part of why so many people watching this video remember parents or grandparents who seemed almost unable to spend money freely, even decades later, even once they clearly could afford to. Modern life, by nearly total contrast, is built around the elimination of waiting, same-day delivery, instant streaming, buy now, pay later financing. Nearly every modern convenience is specifically engineered to remove the experience of waiting from daily life entirely. This is not, on its own, a moral failure, but it does mean that an entire generation has grown up with almost no practice tolerating the very thing that Depression-era households were forced to master: the ability to want something, need something even, and simply wait, without panic, until the timing was right. Lesson 12. The goal was never comfort. The goal was continuity. This final lesson ties every previous one together, and it is the lesson this entire video has really been building toward. Depression-era households were not trying to live well. In most cases, living well was simply not an option available to them. and pretending otherwise would dishonor exactly how hard those years actually were. What they were trying to do, every single day, for years at a time, was keep the household alive as a functioning unit, fed, sheltered, together, and capable of trying again tomorrow. That single shift in goal changes everything about how a family behaves under pressure. A household focused on comfort optimizes for how things feel today. A household focused on continuity optimizes for whether the same household will still be standing, together, a year from now. Every lesson on this list, diversified income, distributed trust, shared shelter, continuous food production, geographic flexibility, neighborhood cooperation, relentless repair, whole family earning, rationed comfort, managed shame, and taught patience, was, underneath everything else, simply a strategy for continuity. Modern households, for the most part, are optimized for comfort. That is not an accusation. It is simply the honest result of decades spent in relative economic stability, where continuity could largely be assumed and comfort became the only remaining variable worth improving. But comfort and continuity are not the same skill, and a household that has spent 30 years practicing comfort has not, by definition, spent any of that time practicing continuity. That is the real, uncomfortable center of this video. Not that people today are weaker, lazier, or less capable than the families of the 1930s. It is that most modern households have simply never been asked the question those families were asked, for years at a time, without any choice in the matter. Could you keep this family alive, together, functioning, and fed if the normal rules simply stopped applying for a very long time? The families in this video did not know the answer to that question either until the moment they were forced to find out. And they found out, 12 times over, in 12 different ways, that being poor and being helpless were never actually the same thing. 12 lessons, and not one of them came from a textbook, a government program, or a plan anyone chose in advance. They came from families who had no other option but to figure it out, month after month, year after year, for the better part of a decade. This was never really a video about the 1930s. It was a video about a kind of household intelligence that decade forced into existence, and that decade alone did not invent. It simply revealed it, the way pressure reveals the true strength of anything. Diversified income, distributed trust, shared shelter, continuous food, flexible geography, neighborhood cooperation, relentless repair, whole family effort, rationed comfort, managed shame, taught patience, all of it aimed at a single, unglamorous goal, staying alive, together, as a functioning household, for as long as the crisis demanded, with no promise of when it would end. None of this is being offered to you as a comfortable memory. The families who lived it were often cold, often frightened, often ashamed, and often genuinely hungry. Nothing about that decade deserves to be dressed up as charming. But inside all of that hardship was a kind of preparation that most modern households, through no real fault of their own, have simply never had to build. We have not been tested the way they were tested, not yet. That is the real question this video leaves behind, and it is not a comfortable one. If a real crisis lasted not for weeks, but for years, no single paycheck, no single bank, no single easy answer, how many of these 12 lessons would your own household already know how to practice? And how many would you be learning for the very first time, under pressure, the way they had to? They were poor, many of them for a very long time. They were frightened, more often than they ever let their own children see. But they were not helpless. And whatever your own family's story is, whether someone in it lived through those exact years, or simply carried the habits of someone who did, that resilience did not disappear. It is still available to be remembered, and in many cases, still available to be practiced. If this video brought back a memory of a parent, a grandparent, or a way of living you grew up around without fully understanding why, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments which of these 12 lessons your own family actually lived. Somebody else watching this might read your memory and finally understand their own parents a little better because of it. They had less, but in ways modern life has quietly forgotten, they knew more.